I know, you might have clicked on this video and thought to yourself, oh look, another person on YouTube who's trying to generate clicks by ragging on Disney adults. I can't deny that when I actually search Disney adults as a topic, they do generally seem to be a punching bag that generates easy clicks for people, but after skimming through some of those videos, I found that they were either just mean-spirited commentary where people would point to obnoxious TikTok influencers and say, haha, aren't they weird guys? Or were otherwise just jumbled messes of bad information about theme park operation from people who then went in circles and made no points other than there are adults who enjoy going to Disney and knew that putting Disney adults in the title would generate substantial viewership. If you've been watching me for a while though, you know that I don't make a video unless I have a different perspective or something new to add to the conversation. So let me be clear, I do think there is a very specific type of person who I think qualifies as a quote Disney adult, and that their choices actively harm the Disney theme park experience. But the question is, what is a Disney adult? If I look at myself, I certainly recognize that I'm a Disney fan, and that I find the history of the company fascinating as an American cultural institution, and their theme parks were something that I grew up recognizing as the gold standard of themed entertainment. You know that I've been incredibly critical of Disney from a leadership perspective, but that's because, as a park fan, I'm just constantly frustrated with how this company is running its park experiences because they're chasing short-term profit and turning their parks into big, superficial billboards of movie brand synergy, instead of, actual theme parks where placemaking and theming are the most important creative aspect. That's not to say that I'm against utilizing intellectual property in the parks either, as it can obviously be pretty great when implemented in a themed area specifically designed for it, like Fantasyland. But the issue I have is nonsensical decision making, like actively removing the movie making aspect that tied all of the IP into Hollywood studios, or just shoving in random properties wherever, like Avengers Campus or Avatar into California Adventure, or bringing the Guardians of the Galaxy into Epcot. The emphasis on Disney IP not only oversaturates the parks with thematically unconnected attractions, but it comes at the expense of creative original attractions that the company is too afraid to invest in because they are risk adverse to a serious fault. The new test track probably only stayed an original concept because General Motors is the sponsor. But look, you actually designed an interesting ride that is also refreshing because it's not just slapping a character onto the ride system. If GM had dropped out as a sponsor, I have no doubt the test track would have turned into some clumsily implemented Cars attraction where you meet Lightning McQueen in a virtual racing simulator or some other nonsense. And you know what? There would be a ton of people with zero consumer standards for themed entertainment cheering on a bad idea like this, otherwise known as Disney adults. Grown people who engage with the Disney parks at a stunningly superficial level and actively reinforce bad decisions made by company leadership. These are the same kind of people who made trivial complaints about Tiana's Bayou Adventure because Tiana wasn't in her specific dress from the film, or who were suddenly okay with the low-budget tackiness of converting Paradise Pier into Pixar Pier, simply because they recognized the iconography of the characters that were pasted onto everything. When I was growing up, I recognized Disney as the undisputed industry leader, not just because their parks were thematically cohesive and IP was implemented tastefully most of the time, but because their theming and attractions had depth. Take the cultural history on showcase in Spaceship Earth, or the real science of living with the land, and contrast them with the Guardians of the Galaxy, who, if they weren't in Cosmic Rewind, really wouldn't make much of a difference to the ride experience. There are so many people who praise the attraction as the best Disney ride ever made, and while I can agree that the track layout is spectacular, the actual Guardians of the Galaxy aspect is just god-awful, not just through its superficiality, but through the absolutely atrocious writing of the pre-show, which is both boring and painfully unfunny. The point I'm making is that Disney uses their intellectual property as a crutch for half-baked attraction design, and while there are moments of brilliance here and there, like in certain scenes in Tiana's, the new test track, or even the Beacon Barrel Bar over by Pirates of the Caribbean, the mostly forgettable or even incompetent attraction design is just really not acceptable for a cultural institution like Disney, which once had a lot more meaning and cultural depth than its parks, rather than just simply vomiting characters everywhere. As a theme park fan, I'm incredibly frustrated with Disney leadership for making these decisions because of the long-term and expensive damage it's causing to their park experiences and branding, and yet, I always feel like I'm fighting with the demographic of people known as the Disney adult, who will make every possible excuse to defend the company because their standard for what makes Disney good is simply recognizing characters that they know. There is absolutely a large divide between theme park fans who once saw Disney as the leader in themed entertainment, and now this new demographic that is specifically being catered to by Disney leadership. And the result is now, well, Disney becoming more akin to Six Flags, in the sense that it's just a bunch of random characters being thrown about everywhere to appeal to sheltered suburbanites who have no actual standards for the entertainment that they consume. So today, I wanted to actually define and dive into the differences between theme park fans and Disney adults, because on the surface, to an outsider, the distinction may not be clear. And I wanted to highlight why the phenomenon of the Disney adult is such a detrimental catalyst of negative changes to the Disney parks. To begin, I wanted to answer the question of, what makes someone a theme park fan, and how is it different than the people who exclusively go to Disney? Oh, also, please leave a like on the video if you're so inclined. When I was growing up, I was absolutely fascinated by Walt Disney World, and as a native Floridian, while I did enjoy the theming of other parks like Universal, Wish Gardens, and SeaWorld, I saw Disney as that high standard that no one else could really touch. I loved classic Universal attractions like Confrontation, E.T., Earthquake, and Jaws, and outside of that, attractions like Journey to Atlantis had a high appeal as well, but I always compared them to feeling like something that Disney would build because they really were the industry standard. I wasn't the only one either, as I remember how people perceived Universal as a quote, scary version of Disney because of how intense their dark rides were in comparison, which was shocking to so many people at the time. As a kid, I was always a fan of themed entertainment more broadly though, whether it was my first experience with a rainforest cafe, to themed aquariums and zoos, or to themed museums in the Washington Mall, or places like the Kennedy Space Center. I enjoyed the rare dark ride I could find in other parks like Dollywood's Blazing Fury, or the Curse of Dark Castle at Busch Gardens Williamsburg. Since starting this channel, I've also learned a tremendous amount about the themed industry, and looking at parks throughout the world like Efteling or Phantasialand, I'm seeing themed entertainment that I find to be incredibly interesting, and is oftentimes a lot better realized than from what I'm seeing out of the current era of Disney. Yet, there are people who would never appreciate this kind of entertainment simply because it doesn't have a familiar movie character attached, and oftentimes, those people will never venture outside of Disney either, completely writing off other experiences because they specifically want some nebulous cutesy Disney branding. So the question is, what is a theme park fan, and what do other people not understand about the appeal? I've been thinking about this question for a long time and was having trouble coming up with an answer, but I remember a very specific moment as a child while riding the Magic Kingdom version of Pirates of the Caribbean. Right after the drop, and emerging out into the battle scene between the ship and the fort, I remember looking up at the ceiling and just being fascinated by observing the air ducts and how they were painted black to blend them into the scene, even though most people weren't going to look up there anyways. It was at that moment that I realized that I was fascinated by the attempt of the illusion, trying to immerse people into this atmospheric environment and moving through various scenes to tell a story. There was something magical about watching the animatronics emulating pirates and townsfolk, something captivating about observing the details and effects of the sets, and a sense of fascination that Disney went to the lengths of even painting the air ducts to maintain the illusion as much as possible. I grew up hearing people describing the Disney magic of the parks, but for me as a young child, I always interpreted that to mean the sense of atmosphere and surrealism of the dark rides, and not what most people actually meant, which was probably a vacation insulated from the outside world. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love walking around the Eisner-era resorts and appreciating the depth of theming, and I can understand why feeling like you're in a bubble is appealing. But I think that a lot of people fail to understand that sense of surrealism that comes from appreciating the illusion of themed attractions. Why do some people understand this feeling and a lot of others don't though? Well, weirdly enough, the answer clicked for me in Edinburgh this past summer. I was touring the city's castle and was walking through a museum that covered Scotland's military history, and I encountered a miniature diorama depicting the Battle of Salerno during World War II. That was when the thought occurred to me that theme parks are really just life-size dioramas, and that the appeal of world building, or maybe observing someone else's attempt at it, is an inherent part of human creativity that has wide appeal. That's why model builders are so passionate, or why games like Roller Coaster or Zoo Tycoon have continued to remain popular. There's an inherent human desire to tell stories and build environments around them, whether through writing, filmmaking, or other forms of art, and why inherently creative toys, such as Lego, are popular with kids or even adults who have strong imaginations. That's why I've always found theme parks and themed entertainment fascinating, because the attempt to bring those creative world-building aspirations into a full-scale experience is inherently interesting. You know the illusion is just an illusion, but observing and analyzing the artist's intent, or knowing the complicated effort and technology that goes into all of this, is a big part of the appeal. Have you ever encountered the kind of person who says, "Why would I go to Disney and see a fake castle when I can travel to Europe and see a real one?" They're obviously both appealing for very different reasons, but the person who dismisses themed entertainment as some sort of fake, unworthy emulation of the real world is clearly missing the point. Because, well, the illusion is the point. It's just impressive to see the attempt at bringing a fantasy castle into the real world, between the forced perspective to give it scale, and also because of the actual scale itself, essentially blowing a model up into a giant structure purely for entertainment purposes. Of course, themed entertainment has different levels of intent and doesn't have to be completely immersive to be appealing, because I also enjoy decorated spaces with a theme like Cracker Barrel or a Bass Pro Shop, but I think that fundamentally, a fascination with themed entertainment comes from that desire to simulate life or to want to tell a story. The problem, of course, is that as widespread as this interest is, there are many people who just simply lack that creative spark, and so they don't get it. I think of the unimaginative businessmen that Walt Disney vocally hated, who live in a dull and sterile corporate world run by money, and I think that's a fundamental part of why Disney is going down the path that it is today, and throwing theming out the window. It's why the new core of Epcot is this type of bland minimalism that showcases instances of shallow theming in Disney IP, believing that simply the presence of iconography is enough to get people excited. Society certainly contains many creative people who love and engage with the art of others, whether it be film buffs, theater goers, or model makers, but there are many other people who I think are just not capable of understanding this appeal, and I think that's why there is a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes for a theme park fan. Unlike other artistic disciplines, theme parks are also significantly more expensive to engage with and limited geographically, and so less accessible, which is why theme park fandom feels rather niche. Even so, for the less creatively inspired, I think that themed entertainment does appeal to a broader demographic of people, but probably at a more subconscious level. The average person might not look around and notice the small details of Main Street USA, but I think they can feel the impact through the cohesion of the experience. It's why when you go to a park that doesn't do theming well, you can tell that something is off, but can't quite place exactly why. There are, however, people who will never get it, like the corporate businessman, the angry grandfather that you drag into the parks and put into a shirt featuring Grumpy from Snow White, and ironically, of all people, Disney adults. The question now is, what exactly is a Disney adult? Immediately, I think of them as someone who wears a lot of Disney merchandise, often does Disney bounding when visiting the parks, and has no real identity outside of just talking about Disney all the time. While I think all of that is accurate, I also need to clarify that just because you wear the merch and bound as a character, it doesn't mean that you qualify as a Disney adult. I know plenty of well-rounded people who enjoy the aesthetic of the ears, or who like to bound as characters every once in a while, which really is just good fun if that's something that you enjoy. But when it becomes your entire personality and you have no actual volition outside of identifying with the iconography of Disney intellectual property, that's when I lose respect for you. A Disney adult will almost always dress in Disney merch, but if you're categorizing all people who dress that way as Disney adults, then I simply think that you're wrong and mean-spirited, and are probably ragging on people that don't deserve it simply as engagement bait. No, a Disney adult is something much more primal. They're the kind of person who will recoil if you suggest going to Universal. They're the kind of person who can't stop telling their coworkers about their next quarterly Disney trip and has to reference Disney in every aspect of their life. They are the kind of person who will blindly endorse every single change made to the Disney parks and will shout from the rooftops how magical it all is. They are the consumer with no standards, who has fixated specifically on Disney at a superficial level and completely lacks critical thought. A good example of this is Moana Journey of Water, which is an interactive water attraction placed awkwardly in the middle of Epcot. While it's true that Disney has tried to erase the futuristic theming of Future World, it has created a bizarre naming system for different areas that are actually corporate buzzwords rather than themed lands. They didn't do a great job of actually removing the futuristic and technological aspect of the area. When I see a Moana attraction in a place that it clearly doesn't fit, I can't help but hate it, because who actually thought that this was a good idea? It's a shame, because the water effects, when they're working at least, are actually fun, and this could have been dressed up in a way that's genuinely educational and could have fit Future World. There's potential in this concept for something great and appropriate for Epcot, and that's what is so frustrating, because there's a corporate mandate to shove Disney characters into everything, even when they have no business being there. Worse, there are so many grown adults who look at this, clasp their hands together, and will proclaim how cute it all is and how wonderful Disney has been to keep evolving the parks. As a theme park fan, I absolutely hate the inability of corporate Disney to come up with interesting ideas, and worse, Disney adults will back them every single time. They are not theme park fans who care about the integrity of the experience or the theming, but will only go to the parks to literally see familiar iconography. I think about a relatively recent experience I had within the last year or so, where I was walking through Epcot during the Flower and Garden Festival. I passed by a group of people, and one woman in that group noticed a topiary nearby that was shaped like Goofy. To the clear disinterest of everyone else, she exclaims, "Oh my god, it's Goofy! Look guys, it's Goofy! Look, it's Goofy!" I thought to myself, what do you get out of this? What's the point? What's the appeal? Maybe if I was a child, I might think it's neat that someone was able to design the shape of a character into a bush, but I see you here as a grown adult who has no other thought behind your eyes beyond pointing and trying to get other people to acknowledge that yes, this is in fact a Disney character topiary. It's that kind of superficial interaction with the park that makes you a Disney adult, someone who doesn't actually enjoy the place you're in for what it is, but simply because, again, you only identify with Disney character iconography, and the thought stops there. It seems ridiculous, almost a joke even, to suggest that this kind of person exists. But when I go to theme parks, I like to people watch and see how they react to various aspects of the parks. For example, I like to buy a pass to Halloween Horror Nights every year, and I'm always curious how the intellectual property brings in very specific demographics of people. For example, 2023's Last of Us House and 2025's Fallout brought in a lot of video game fans, and while waiting in line, I would excitedly hear them talk about what they expected to see from the games. 2025's Five Nights at Freddy's brought in a lot of teenagers who were only really there to fake scream at an ear-piercing pitch and ruin the experience for everyone else. And 2023's Chucky Ultimate Kill Count had a noticeably higher quantity of drunk and aggressive park guests who got into fights in the line, because I guess there's a trashy and edgy demographic that was attracted to the property. There's certainly nothing wrong with enjoying any of these, but sometimes they really do have problematic fan bases, and you really do see them show up in the parks. As a theme park fan, I love the artistry and storytelling that goes into the houses, but there are many people who will show up, do 2 or 3 things, one of which is said intellectual property that attracted them there, and then leave and complain that they didn't do anything. It's not quite the same as a Disney adult who will love anything that Disney does as long as a character is slapped onto it, but it's really not that different in that you didn't actually come for the theme park, but rather for a property that you happen to be familiar with. I've never been on TikTok as a platform, but I remember there was a couple who posted videos on there criticizing Tokyo Disney Sea as being overrated because it wasn't Disney enough for them. I mean, how astounding is that? Criticizing a park that is often regarded as the best in the world for the sheer audacity of its theming and detail, simply because you weren't constantly bombarded with cutesy, capital D Disney branding the entire time. From my observation, a Disney adult is a very specific type of person, one who lives an insulated suburban life, is ignorant to the outside world other than through obsessive, bizarre Disney media consumption, and is always upbeat and positive to a degree that feels inauthentic. Honestly, I don't even really trust people unless they have a bit of practical cynicism instilled in them. However, you're always going to have people who say, "Why can't you just leave other people alone? You might not like them, but they're not doing any harm, just let them be." And I would answer to that, actually, they are doing me harm. Their blind endorsement of corporate Disney, both through their voice and their wallets, has a direct correlation on the destruction of theming and storytelling in the Disney parks. They signal to Disney leadership that they don't have to actually put effort into the creative direction, maintenance, and general park experience because there will always be a demographic of people who will line up and shove money at the company regardless of what they do. The very existence of the Disney adult is a toxic influence that Disney leadership takes as positive feedback, and as a theme park fan who once loved Disney as the quality and creative industry standard, and not just because they were Disney, I think it's clear that Disney adults are actually a huge part of the problem. I think it's important to address a point that will probably come up in the comments, and that's why I'm so highly critical of Disney for its push of intellectual property and not Universal. To me, the difference is very clear. Disney already has pre-established parks with strong cohesive themes, and the current leadership of Disney actively destroys all of that for attractions that don't fit, but feature a marketable intellectual property. A good example is Animal Kingdom, where when it was announced that Avatar would be coming to the park in 2017 and getting its own land, I was immediately skeptical. Fortunately, with the creative direction of Imagineering at the time, this idea was salvaged into a land that actually fit various themes of Animal Kingdom, but instead took a science fiction approach that could be interpreted as a modern manifestation of human relationships to mythical animals and how this shapes the way in which we use animals in storytelling. However, when I look at the direction that the park is taking now in 2025, I see how Disney is completely destroying Dinoland USA, which is truly one of the most brilliantly themed lands ever designed. If you're not a regular watcher on my channel, you might be confused by that statement, but the land had an incredible level of cultural depth that highlighted human relationships to dinosaurs through media. It explored our conception of them as terrifying creatures, but also as a form of cultural kitsch and Americana, covering a wide range of conceptions in an exceptionally detailed land that continue to reveal more and more if you chose to look for it. I understand why most people didn't pick up on this, mistaking the intentionally tacky theming as something cheap. But if you want a real and comprehensive in-depth look at what made Dinoland one of the greatest themed lands ever built, I do have an hour-long video that really dives into why its destruction is so sad. Worse though, is that it's being replaced with a Disney Plus land that has absolutely nothing to do with Animal Kingdom. Yes, it is true that the land does have a Disney animal IP carousel, but will also feature an Encanto and Indiana Jones attraction that I predict will at best only superficially reference animals and will have nothing to do with the deeper themes of the park. Disney is calling this land Tropical Americas, but let's recognize it for what it is. And you know who's absolutely going to love this land? That's right, Disney adults will sing the praises of how cute everything is. But regardless of the quality of the rides, whether they turn out great or not, ultimately they will never fit the park unless Disney puts forth an honest effort, which from the concept was clearly never the intent. Going back to the point about not criticizing Universal for the same thing, well, they don't do the same thing. At their studio parks, they do feature an eclectic collection of rides and shows from various properties, but that's exactly the point. Universal's early parks were founded on literally letting you ride the movies, but while the educational filmmaking aspect has taken a back seat since the 2010s, their parks still feel thematically cohesive, even if improvements could be made. However, if I look at Islands of Adventure and Epic Universe, they're not just shoving random properties in everywhere, and actually have a strong thematic vision for what they want to do. It's also worth noting that most Universal attractions are interesting in spite of the intellectual property, regardless of the actual quality of the films or familiarity with the material. Universal has now built 3 Jurassic World attractions, and they're all top tier, despite the film series itself being just not great. Their immense quality sells me on the idea of Jurassic World a lot better than the actual films do. While Universal undeniably has bad attractions here and there, specifically with VillainCon and DreamWorks Land, their creative process post-2018 is a lot stronger and more consistent than Disney, who often feel like they're throwing darts at a board to choose an intellectual property in a park, and then demand that Imagineering tries to make it fit. Universal understands how intellectual properties drive park attendance along with merchandise and themed food sales, but the design comes first and feels like genuine passion was put into it. Nobody was asking for a land themed to the How to Train Your Dragon franchise, but wow, this is far more interesting than most of what Disney has done throughout the entirety of the Iger era. As a theme park fan, while I really am getting sick of everything needing to be based on a movie or media franchise, where there are so many great original ideas that could be highly successful, at least with Universal, I'm getting great theming and well-designed rides in a way that I'm just not from Disney. A good example of this is if you compare their more recent shows. At Epic Universe, I've seen a lot of mixed reviews of Le Cercle Arcanu, which is based on the Fantastic Beasts spin-off of the Harry Potter franchise. Those films are both critical and commercial failures, but the actual theme park show is far more interesting. However, it's gotten a fair amount of criticism, specifically pointing out the show's logistical issues of packing everyone into the pre-show, and how for the actual performance itself, the pacing is a bit off, and the ending can feel abrupt. I agree with those criticisms and acknowledge that it's a flawed product, but ultimately, there's still a high level of competency in its design that I'm just not seeing from Disney. If we take a look at the new Country Bear Jamboree, it's genuinely awful. Not only are the music choices almost exclusively songs from Disney musicals, which considering that this is meant to be a country musical show, feels so egotistical through how shallow and unnecessary it is, but the actual writing of the show is also just done poorly. For example, the animal busts on the wall make continuous jokes about how they're detached from their bodies, and it was amusing once or twice, but when the joke just keeps going on and on and on, it just makes you groan because you wonder, who thought that this was a good idea? While there are clever elements of the show that I enjoy here and there, like for example the smoke effect coming from the fiddle, it's otherwise just standard corporate Disney nonsense, using intellectual property, in this case songs from their movies, as a crutch for a lack of substance. Another example of this is a recent addition to Hollywood Studios called Disney Villains Unfairly Ever After. This 15-minute show has very little actually going on and is almost purely filler, with the premise being Disney villains are coming into the real world and are crying about how they're all misunderstood. The conclusion of the show essentially boils down to a popularity contest about which villain is the most misunderstood, perfectly illustrating my point that new Disney attractions are literally as shallow as shoving characters in front of you and adding nothing of substance. In the same vein, I guess we can also talk about the new show at Animal Kingdom, Zootopia Better Zoogether. It is, again, filler that relies purely on your recognition of Zootopia as a franchise to draw you in, but throughout the entirety of the show, nothing actually really happens. It's really just a series of loosely related scenes that are shoved together to try to reuse all the sensory effects in place that already existed in the theater. While its predecessor, Tough to Be a Bug, was a really dated show, at least it made sense in the Tree of Life, because obviously insects live in trees, but it was also educational, showcasing biological features of bugs and arachnids, and promoting a message of how these creatures are beneficial to environments and ecosystems. Sure, maybe the information was surface level, but it was presented in a way that was easy for kids to understand, and it's certainly a lot better than the new Zootopia show, which has nothing to do with the Tree of Life or Animal Kingdom, and is essentially best described as pure noise for the sake of noise. Returning back to my original example of Les Cirques Arc Canoe, the actual land of Wizarding Paris is far more interesting than the actual Fantastic Beasts films, and the show itself does a great job of showcasing these incredible creatures, mostly through puppetry. While I think that it too could be criticized for having moments of filler, the overall production is still much stronger and actually has a story that you can follow. The difference between intellectual property, if you're comparing Universal versus Disney, is that Universal takes weak franchises and turns them into fantastic, immersive attractions that are great regardless of the material. But with Disney, they can take a competent movie like Zootopia and turn it into absolute garbage for their parks. A lot of what Disney does nowadays is purely just a showcase of character iconography over actual theming and experience. And so I have to ask, why are they still successful and making money? If you're a theme park enthusiast, it's easy to recognize that Disney just isn't even trying any longer, and it's upsetting to see a company that was once known for its high quality to just throw everything away. For example, I'm still incredibly angry that the Rivers of America are being taken out of Magic Kingdom, because not only is the Cars replacement a bizarre idea born purely out of merchandising potential in the park, but because there was so much missed potential for the river that was never realized. I always point to Disneyland as an example of this, as when Galaxy's Edge was being constructed there, the real benefit to the park was the updated river, which had new scenery and effects that really enhanced it. And you know what? The various attractions that circle the river are quite popular and benefit from these changes. Meanwhile, Magic Kingdom's river was neglected for 50 years, and when I bring up how awful its removal is, and how I wish that Disney had actually invested in it, there's always some simpleton who would chime in and say that nobody ever went on the riverboat or Tom Sawyer Island, and that Cars is a good change for the park. I think it really says a lot, and that there are certain people out there who will never experience the other attractions outside of those that feature recognizable characters. And that again brings me back to the divide between theme park fans and Disney adults. An excuse that I always hear from them is that Disney makes the changes that they do because it's all for kids, like with the new Country Bear Jamboree. While I think it is certainly true that many kids will enjoy things that they recognize from their favorite films, for instance, my niece who likes Frozen was enthralled with Frozen Ever After, the general sentiment that kids are incapable of engaging with the parks beyond this is really actually an insult to them. My niece may have loved Frozen Ever After, but was also equally engaged with other attractions like Expedition Everest and the Haunted Mansion, and generally was actually much more excited by Universal over Disney, despite not being familiar with most of their IP. Speaking for myself as a child, my favorite park as a kid was Epcot, specifically because I appreciated that it was a lot of unique and original ideas. I grew up craving the atmosphere of the first quarter of Living with the Land, being absorbed with the surreal scenes in Spaceship Earth, and being fascinated by the close-up encounters with dinosaurs in Ellen's Energy Adventure. I liked how strange and disconcerting the scenes were in Maelstrom, and while I felt that El Rio del Tiempo was never great from an educational point of view, I still really enjoyed the atmosphere created by the sets. As a child, I liked Disney IP too, especially with attractions like Peter Pan's Flight and Snow White's Scary Adventures, but I also liked how they were contained mostly just to Magic Kingdom, and how the other parks had distinct identities and offered very different experiences from one another. To say that Disney only builds things for kids is partially true, because they know that a lot of kids will beg their parents to buy the merch. But what Disney also knows is that a lot of adults never really developed beyond early childhood either, and are some of their biggest financial supporters. I think of the people who tell me that I don't understand Galaxy's Edge because you have to be a Star Wars fan to get it, which is actually really funny because I enjoy the George Lucas films and a lot of the expanded universe. The reason I don't like Galaxy's Edge is because it's not a great example of themed design, throwing in a lot of literal junk to fill up space, rather than taking the time to construct an interesting and explorable world in the same way that something like Dinoland was. For a different example, I remember a specific instance where I was at someone's house, and the 2023 version of the Haunted Mansion movie was playing in the background. I made a joke to somebody about how bad the film was, and someone who I definitely would classify as a Disney adult had to aggressively interject and say that he liked the film, as if I had personally attacked him. First, the Haunted Mansion film could not be a better example of a corporate mandated brand synergy idea, because if you've seen this film, it could not be clearer that everyone involved was just showing up for a paycheck, and there was absolutely no love put into this. Second, if you so blindly identify with this film that you're willing to defend it as a Haunted Mansion fan, then I don't even think that you're actually a fan. You engaged with this purely at a branding level, and as a Haunted Mansion fan myself, I thought this movie was terrible because of how it fails to live up to the appeal of the classic attraction. Disney as a company is throwing away its cultural relevance, both through lazy, risk-averse filmmaking and through the actual parks themselves, opting for the Six Flags playbook and throwing in random characters everywhere to support a lack of competent attraction design. Yeah, there are a few highlights of greatness here and there, like the new test track, the Adventureland Treehouse, or the Beacon Barrel, but it appears that when Disney Corporate has its hand in most projects, that's when everything fails. For theme park fans, and for a larger general public that likes theming but isn't necessarily invested in it, Disney is becoming less and less interesting, and I think that will be massively detrimental over a long period of time. Disney adults are undoubtedly their target audience, people who will support them vocally and financially regardless of what they do, because they don't actually have any interest in the parks beyond corporate Disney branding. The drop in Disney quality over the Iger era has been undeniable, and when myself or others point out these issues and try to provide a voice because we want Disney to change direction, who is it that automatically has to come to Disney's defense and will tell you that you're wrong for wanting anything other than consuming capital D Disney branding? Disney adults are absolutely a toxic problem and are something that I felt needed addressing. If you made it here to the end of the video, know that there wasn't a lot of structure throughout this script, but it's more just a collection of individual thoughts I've had over the past year that I felt like I needed to express. At the end of this though, I think it's important to remember that people who engage with IP superficially are just an inherent part of the population. It's always bizarre when I read about people who went to Universal just to experience the Wizarding World, and literally nothing else. It's the kind of people who show up to Halloween Horror Nights simply because they recognize a property, and of course, the Disney adults who have made the aesthetics of Disney their entire personality. You can't get rid of them, but you can certainly influence the conversation and point out why their feedback is detrimental to the experience of others. Hopefully though, through this video, I was able to explain the distinction between theme park fans and Disney adults. And if you think it's important to highlight the problems that I pointed out, one easy way to do that is to just leave a like on the video, which helps boost the message to a larger audience. As always though, if you enjoy videos like these and have not yet subscribed and hit the bell notification yet either, you can also do so now to be alerted to new videos as they're released.